Okay, let's head back to VS Code and we'll configure AutoMapper so that it does return what we're looking for here. So we didn't give AutoMapper any additional information. What it did do was a pretty good job of matching properties with properties that have the same name. Where it doesn't work is if the properties have different names. And I just want to take a look at the activity DTO because I don't want to call this profiles, I want to call this attendees because that's what these are. These are attendees, but we're returning the profile information for each attendee. So we'll go to our mapping profile, and what we want to do is, in order to configure properties, then we can say for member. And inside here we say the destination members, and we want to configure the host username. And what we want to do is tell it where to map from. So we'll say O goes to O.map from, and O stands for options here. And map from, we give it a source. What's the source of what we're going to be mapping from? So we'll say S goes to S.attendees, and then we'll specify first or default. And we'll need to bring in system.link to use this. And then we'll add an expression saying X goes to X.isHost. And then we want to say .AppUser.username. And let's move this down so I can fit it on the same screen, and then finish with a semicolon. So if we take a look at this small change, and we'll go back to Postman, and we'll click on Send again, what we should find after the application restarts is that we get an error, and it's telling us that it's got a problem with error mapping types, and all this is that we changed the name of the profiles to attendees. And if we go and take a look at the terminal, then we get some very clear information from AutoMapper actually that tells us what it's missing. And it's telling us that it's got a destination member attendees, and AutoMapper has a missing type map configuration or unsupported mapping. And it's telling us that it can't go from activity attendee to the profile. And all this means is that we need to give it that configuration as well. So if you ever see a mapping error, always come into the terminal because you get some very clear error information about what's going on here. What we're saying here is that we need a new map because our activity DTO has an attendees property. And what we need to map for this one is we need to map from our activity attendee to our profile object. So what we'll do is we'll say create map from activity attendee to, and we're using profile in here, so don't fall into the trap of specifying profile. We'll need to use the full namespace here, so we'll say profiles and profile. And then what we'll do is say for member, and we'll add the profile properties. So we'll have our display name, and we'll say we're going to map from, and then the source is going to be s.AppUser and the display name. And then we'll just copy this down 2 more times, and we'll take care of the username and the app user and username, and we'll also take care of the bio and map from AppUser.bio, and we'll ignore the image for the time being. We don't have to specify it here. It's just going to appear as null in what we're returning here. So let's give this another go, and we'll click on send once again, and this time we get our list of activities back along with our host username, which is null for all of our activities that don't have a host. We've only got one, remember, that we've created with any attendees, so let's make sure that one is correct. And what we're looking for here is the test event with Bob as host. And we can see our host username is set to Bob. That's good. And we've got our attendees. And we don't have a bio or an image, so we'd expect these to be null. But we do see the username and the display name coming back with our activity. And this is what we're looking for right now. Don't worry about other parts of the activities being null or an empty array. That's exactly what we're expecting. We're only interested in the one activity where we created it with an attendee. Now, if we go back to VS Code and let's take a look at our terminal, And let's scroll down to the bottom and let's take a look at the request that we have here. And this is what we're executing against our database. All of this. And notice what we're selecting when we're going to get our user. We're getting properties such as access failed count, the concurrency stamp, the lockout enabled. None of these properties are we using for our attendee. So this is wasted effort. And it doesn't look like the cleanest of queries that we could possibly use. So what we'll do, instead of using eager loading, what we're going to take a look at is using projection instead. And what we want to see is a much cleaner, more efficient query going to SQL than what we're seeing here. And the way that we do that is we can make use of an AutoMapper extension, which allows us to project to an entity or a class like our activity DTO. So let's go back to the list class once again. And when we're using projection, we do not need to eagerly load our related data. And what we're going to do is save our activities, same as we got before, but instead of include, we're going to use project to. And we're going to pass in activity DTO and open parentheses. And what we should be able to bring in is using AutoMapper queryable extensions. So let's bring this in. And this takes one parameter and it needs our configuration provider. And we can get this from the IMapper that we've already injected here. So what we use is mapper, and then we can use the configuration provider that this provides for us. Now, because we're projecting to an activity DTO, if we hover over activities, this now is a type of activity DTO rather than an activity. And what this means is that we do not need to add the mapping function, and we can simply return our activities. Now, we could hand code this, by the way, as well by using a select function that we get from system.link. And we could go ahead and do all of this manually, but AutoMapper makes this super easy for us to do. So we're going to be using AutoMapper to do this for us because it just works great and it makes life very easy. So this is only any good if it actually works. So let's go back and test again in Postman. Make sure that we still get our list of activities. Make sure we still see the properties that we're interested in, and we do. But if we go and take a look at the query, and this is the old one, this big ghastly lots of noise going to our database as the SQL query. And if we scroll back down to the bottom and take a look at our new query, then we can see it's much, much cleaner. We're only going to get the properties that we're interested in. And we've got our activity properties, and we've got the bio, display name, username. We're not seeing all of the additional properties that are in our user table, and we're only selecting specifically the fields that we're interested in. So it makes for a much cleaner SQL query. And a cleaner query has to be a better query in almost all circumstances. So now that we've got this in place for our list of activities, we also need to do the same for our detailed view as well. So let's just go to the details handler, and what we'll do is we'll just do the same thing again. We'll just bring in IMapper and specify mapper, and we'll bring in using AutoMapper, and we'll initialize the field from parameter. And what we'll do is bring down find async, and we'll make use of the project to, and we're going to say activity DTO, and we'll need to bring in AutoMapper queryable extensions and pass in mapper.configurationProvider. Now, the downside to this is that we can't use find async with a projection. Find async doesn't work with this. So what we'll need to use is first or default async, and we'll need to bring in Microsoft Entity Framework Core to use this. But then we can pass this an expression, and we can say x goes to x.id, that's equal to the request.id. And of course, everywhere that we're returning an activity, we're getting an error now, so we need to update all of these to return the activity DTO in the result here, and also in the handler here, and also in the query object up here. And we should get a clean editor window now. And if we go back to Postman, let's just make sure we can get an individual activity, and we'll just use the ID of the one that we know we've got an attendee for. And we'll go to Get Activity Details, and we'll overwrite this GUID, click Send, and we should find success. We've got our host username, all of the properties, and the attendee information as well. Perfect. Next, we'll take a look at how we can add an attendee to an existing event.